Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Nathalie Himmelrich. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is completely self-funded, produced and edited by me, Nathalie Himmelrich. Consider making a small donation to support the podcast. Go to bit.ly/support, capital G, capital T, and podcast. I repeat, bit.ly/supportgt podcast. Thank you so much. And for more information, please visit Nathalie's website, join the podcast Instagram page, and subscribe to the newsletter to receive updates on future episodes. So welcome back to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. You might remember the first part of the 3-part series on grief myth, preconceptions and presumptions. If you haven't listened to it, I recommend you go back to episode 181, where I talk about the grief myth. So today I want to talk about something that shapes the experience of grief and trauma long before a loss or trauma even happens, and often long after. It's not something that's said to us in the wrong moment, not an insensitive comment from a well-meaning friend. It's something more foundational than that. Today we're talking about preconceptions. So what is a preconception? A preconception is a belief or opinion formed before having actual experience or evidence. It is not something decided consciously. It accumulates through your upbringing, your culture, religion, education, even the way grief and trauma was spoken or wasn't spoken about in your family. Also what was modeled by adults in your childhood, what you've learned from films and books, and through social norms and what they have quietly communicated over decades. Preconceptions sit in the background. They often go unexamined precisely because they feel like common sense. They feel like this is the way things are, not like a belief system at all. In the context of grief and trauma, a preconception shapes the framework a person brings to loss and trauma. It determines what you expect grief and trauma to look like in yourself and in others before it even had a chance to show you what it actually is. So let's just make a brief distinction to presumption, which I'm going to talk about fully in part 3. But by contrast, a presumption is an assumption made in a specific moment, a conclusion drawn on the spot without adequate evidence. So presumptions are active and situational, where preconceptions are the lens we carry into an experience. Presumptions are the snap judgments made during or about it. So the clearest way to hold the distinction is preconceptions are formed before and presumptions are made during or about something. So as I said, we'll return to presumptions in full in episode or part 3 of 3, which will be episode 185. So let's have a look of how preconceptions relate to the grief myth we heard in episode 181. Grief myth, as said before, are widely circulated beliefs about grief that are not supported by research or clinical evidence. Preconceptions and grief myth are closely related, but they are not identical. A grief myth is a culturally shared false belief, something the broader culture accepts and transmits. A preconception, however, is personal. It is the individual's internalized version of that myth. So the myth exists in culture, the preconception lives in the person. Every grief myth has the potential to become a preconception. So when someone absorbs the cultural idea that grief should resolve within a certain time frame and carries that belief into their own experience of loss, the myth has become a preconception. It is now operating from inside. This distinction matters because the myth can be corrected with information. Preconceptions require something more. They require you as the person to notice that the belief exists, trace where it came from, and actively examine whether it still holds true for you or not. So let's now have a look at the 10 most common preconceptions that appear consistently in the grief research and in clinical settings. Each one was formed with some logic behind it, an attempt to make sense of loss, trauma, to provide comfort, and to establish order. That is worth acknowledging. The intention behind most of these preconceptions is not cruelty. It is the human desire to make an unimaginably difficult situation somehow more manageable. But the intention does not determine the impact. Each of these preconceptions, when they are carried unchallenged into an actual experience of grief or trauma, they can cause harm. For example, by creating false expectations or by silencing the authentic responses that you might have, and often by adding a layer of judgment on top of an already devastating experience. Similar to in the grief myth, we're going to look at each one through the same structure. Look at where it comes from, what it intends, how it harms. I'm going to share a relatable example, and then a reframe. It's not a fix, not a silver lining, but a more accurate way of understanding what is actually happening. Number 1, grief follows predictable stages. I'm sure you've heard that before. And this comes directly from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's model in 1969, which goes through the stages of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, which was developed through her work with people who were dying, not with the bereaved. The model spread quickly because it offered something deeply confronting, the idea that grief has a known map. For a culture that is uncomfortable with the open-ended nature of loss, a stage model provides the reassurance of structure, and the intention is order and hope, the belief that grief has a shape that can be followed through to a destination. It can, however, also harm. For example, when grief does not follow the expected sequence, or when someone is not angry when they think they should be, or when acceptance feels nothing like what was described. The model might create a secondary problem, the sense that something is wrong with how you are grieving. The research is clear on this. George Bonanno's longitudinal work on bereavement demonstrates that grief trajectories are highly variable. The stage model, despite its widespread use, does not reflect how most people actually grieve. So applying it too rigidly might give one person a measuring stick against which they consistently fail. Imagine a father who lost his son. He finds himself laughing at a memory just 3 days after the funeral. He waits for the anger stage, but it doesn't come, and he begins to wonder if his love was real, if his grief is real. The model gave him a map which he's trying to find himself on, but can't. So let's reframe this. Personally, I love the metaphor of grief being a landscape rather than a sequence, and every person moves through it differently. There's no correct order. The presence or absence of any particular emotional state carries no information about the depth of love or the legitimacy of the loss. If you want to know more about different grief metaphors I love to use, there's a couple of episodes which I'll link in the show note. Number 2, grief has a timeline. So most cultures carry an implicit and sometimes explicit expectation about how long grief should last. In many Western contexts, this is a matter of weeks or months. Bereavement leave policies often reflect this. The return to a normal functioning is expected quickly, and prolonged grief is often interpreted as pathological, as wallowing, or as failure to cope. The intention behind a timeline is practical. It attempts to offer an end point, which in turn offers hope that the pain will not last forever. So, Where's the harm? Exactly in that. Because the experience usually is that significant grief persists beyond the culturally accepted window. The griever often begins to receive subtle or direct messages that they should now be further along. And this can come from family, from employers, from friends, even from within themselves. And the result is frequently that grief goes underground. It is hidden or pretended to not be there, but the truth is it does not end. It's just hidden, and hidden grief is not resolved grief. For example, research by Colin Murray Parks and others consistently shows that significant bereavement can be carried for years without that indicating any pathology whatsoever. So the timeline creates a false standard, and the gap between the standard and the reality is painful in its own right. So imagine a woman whose husband died 14 months ago. She is told by her sister that it's time to think about dating again, and that her husband would have wanted her to be happy. But she is not ready. She feels guilty for not being ready, and she begins to wonder if her grief is abnormal. For the reframe, it is important to know that there is no clinical basis for a grief timeline. Duration alone tells us nothing about whether grief is being carried well or badly, healthily or not. What matters is not how long grief lasts, but what is happening within that time. Whether you as the person have support, whether meaning is slowly emerging, whether you are able to function in ways that matters to them, to you, even imperfectly. 3. Not crying means not grieving. So tears are the most visible and socially recognizable sign of distress. In most cultures, crying at a funeral is the expected signal of grief. So this preconception likely developed because visible emotional expression provided a shared social language. It communicated the loss to those around the bereaved and invited support. The intention is connection, the belief that visible grief signals real grief, and that real grief merits care. But this is where the harm comes in, because when a person does not cry, maybe because of their nervous system, their personality, their cultural background, maybe even their gender conditioning, or their history of trauma, or simply because grief does not always produce tears, they can face a serious problem. Others may question the sincerity of their loss, and the grieving person themselves may begin to question whether they loved enough, whether they cared enough. The absence of a particular expression is being used as an evidence about the presence of love, but they are not the same thing. Imagine a man standing at his mother's graveside and feeling nothing except a strange numbness. He doesn't cry at the funeral or in the weeks following. Colleagues remark that he seems to be handling it well. He knows he's not handling it well. He is frozen, but no one can see it, so no one asks. Let's reframe this. Emotional expression varies by individual, by nervous system response and by culture, and by the specific nature of the loss. Tears are just one signal of grief. They are not the signal. There could also be numbness, silence, agitation, physical symptoms, compulsive activity. All of these are also grief. The absence of crying communicates nothing about the depth of loss or love. 4. You must achieve closure. Closure, the idea that grief ends with a definite emotional resolution, a clean break from the loss, is a concept that gained cultural currency largely through its use in popular psychology and media. It appeals to a cultural preference for completion and forward motion. The intention is merciful. It suggests that the pain of loss is finite and that the wound closes. But the research does not support closure as a fixed endpoint. In fact, a significant body of work, most notably the continuing bonds theory developed by Klaas, Silverman and Nickman, demonstrates that maintaining of an ongoing connection with someone who has died is not only common but healthy. So pushing towards closure can pathologize a natural and adaptive process. It can also make grieving people feel that any continued connection to the person they lost, any continued longing, or any continued conversation with them in their mind is a failure to move on. But it is not. Imagine a mother who lost her daughter 6 years ago, still talks to her daughter's photograph each morning. A well-meaning therapist suggests this may be keeping her stuck. So she stops and feels she has lost her daughter a second time. Now this preconception absolutely deserves a complete reframe, because continuing bonds, not just in my personal but also in my professional experience, with those who have died is so healthy and normal and often sustaining part of grief. Closure is not the goal, integration is. The loss becoming a part of who you are and who the person was, carrying but not abandoned. This is not pathology. It is love adapting to absence. Number 5, grief is only about death. Well, because death is the most visible and culturally acknowledged form of loss, grief has become almost synonymous with bereavement. Funerals, mourning rituals, condolence cards, all of these social structures exist to acknowledge death. Very few equivalent structures exist for other forms of loss. The intention behind associating grief with death is social organization, a shared ritual response to a shared human experience. The problem is that this preconception leaves enormous amounts of grief entirely unacknowledged, such as divorce, estrangement from a child or parent, the loss of a pregnancy, and the loss of a life that was planned and expected but never came, the loss of identity following illness or disability, the loss of safety following trauma. All of these produce grief that is real, somatic, and often significant. So when a person experiences one of these losses and does not have access to the language of grief, they may not understand what they're feeling or why it is so severe. The loss is not recognized and therefore neither the need for support. If you want to find out more, there's a whole series of understanding grief and trauma, which I'll link in the show notes. Imagine a woman who miscarried at 10 weeks, returns to work after a few days. Her colleagues say at least it was early. She has no framework to understand why she is still devastated 3 months later. She does not know that what she is carrying is grief. So grief is the natural response to any significant loss, whether that is a person, a relationship, a role, a future, a sense of safety, or a version of oneself. Death is just one cause of grief. It is not the only one, and limiting the definition abandons everyone living with loss that does not fit that category. Number 6. Staying strong protects others. The impulse to suppress one's own grief in order to protect family members, particularly children or a surviving partner, comes from love. It is an act of sacrifice, or it is intended as one. This preconception is especially common in men, in parents, and in anyone who occupies a caretaking role in a family system. The intention is care. Take on the pain privately so others don't have to carry it. I still remember a person saying to me after a few months after the death of my daughter, "Wouldn't it be time to focus on your husband and your other child?" So the research consistently shows that suppression of grief does not protect others. It models emotional avoidance. Children who observe a parent suppressing grief learn that grief is something must be hidden. Spouses who carry grief in silence become unreachable to partners who may need exactly that connection. And the person who is staying strong is not processing. They are postponing, and the postponed grief does not disappear. It surfaces later, often in a more complicated form. Delayed grief is well documented in bereavement literature and is frequently more difficult to work through than grief that was expressed in real time. Imagine a father whose wife died. He is determined not to cry in front of his children. He waits until they are asleep. His teenage daughter assumes he doesn't miss her mother as much as she does. So the distance between them grows. Neither knows the other is grieving just as hard. So expressing grief in age-appropriate ways with appropriate support does not harm children or partners. It models that grief is a normal human response to loss, that emotions can be felt and survived, and that the loss was real and significant. Allowing grief to be visible is not weakness. It is an act of honesty that can become the foundation for shared healing. Number 7. Time heals all wounds. Well, if you haven't heard that being said, you must have lived under a rock, because this is perhaps the oldest and most widely held preconception about grief. It could even be a myth. It is offered almost universally as comfort, and it contains a genuine truth. Acute pain typically softens over time. And the intention is hope, reassurance that the unbearable will become more bearable. And in many cases, it does. But also, the word time heals old wounds. I mean, the idea was that wounds were those kind of wounds like a cut. Yes, that heals. But grief or trauma is a different kind of wound. So why does it harm? Because time is not a mechanism. What happens within time determines outcome, not the passage of time itself. A person who receives no support, who has no access to processing, who is isolated, who uses avoidance as a primary coping strategy, that person can find themselves years into their loss and still carrying grief in its most acute form, and sometimes without understanding why. I have this saying that if a person is standing at the side of the road with a flat tire, and if they're just sitting there, nothing's going to happen. So no time will resolve the tire situation. If, however, they flag someone down and do something within that time, then something might change. So the preconception of time healing becomes harmful when it is used as a reason to not seek support, not to create conditions for healing, and not to acknowledge that grief may need active attention rather than passive endurance. Imagine a man who lost his brother 8 years ago, has been waiting to feel better. He hasn't sought support because everyone told him time would do the work. He's still waiting. He has become increasingly isolated, but frames this as simply being not over it yet. Time creates a possibility of healing. What happens within that time, access to support, the capacity to process, the gradual reconstruction of meaning, connection with others who understand, these are what actually produce change. So grief is not a wound that closes on its own if left untouched. For many people, it requires active care. Number 8. Grief is a private matter. Many families and culture treat grief as something internal, a private experience to be managed within the self or within the immediate family, not shared publicly or even discussed openly. This preconception often carries a dimension of dignity or self-sufficiency. Grief is handled quietly, and this is considered strength. The intention is self-respect and the protection of something intimate from the discomfort of others. The research on grief outcomes is consistent. Supported grief, which is grief that is witnessed, shared, and met with connection, produces better outcomes than isolated grief. Isolation is not neutral. It removes access to the relational resources that are among the most significant factors in how grief is carried over time. The preconception that grief is private can prevent people from asking for help, from joining support groups, from seeing a therapist, even from naming what they're carrying to someone close to them. The silence is not strength. It is often a barrier to healing. Imagine a woman from a family where emotions were never discussed openly, and she finds herself unable to speak about her grief after the death of her father. She attends a support group once and leaves before it starts because it feels wrong to speak about this with strangers. She goes home to an empty house and manages alone for years. Grief is relational in origin. It arises from connection, and it is often most effectively processed in connection. This does not mean forcing public disclosure. It means recognizing that shared grief can be carried differently than isolated grief, and that reaching out, whether to one trusted person or a community of those who understand, is not a violation of dignity. It is access to support that grief very often needs. 9. Returning to normal functioning means you are healed. When someone returns to work or resumes social activities and appears to be coping, the people around them and sometimes the person themselves interpret this as a sign of recovery. The preconception draws an equivalence between functioning and healing. It is understandable. In the absence of visible distress, it is natural to assume that the interior state has stabilized. But functioning and healing are not the same measure. Many people develop the capacity to perform normal tasks and maintain social roles while still carrying significant unprocessed grief. And this is particularly common in high-functioning individuals, in those with strong professional identities, and those who have learned, often through their earlier life experiences, that appearing capable is essential to survival. So the grief is still present. It is simply not visible. And when this is the case, and the assumption of healing is made, support is often withdrawn precisely when it may still be needed. Imagine a woman returning to her demanding job 2 weeks after pregnancy loss. Her manager tells HR that she seems to be doing remarkably well. Her colleagues stop asking, and she performs her role competently while sitting in her car during lunch to cry where no one can see her. The capacity to function is real and often necessary to adaptation. It does not indicate a completion of grief. So the support from friends, family, or professional is not contingent on visible breakdown. It may be most needed precisely when it is least obvious from the outside. Number 10. Trauma and grief are separate experiences. If you believe that, you might not have listened to many of the episodes here, because in many clinical and cultural frameworks, trauma and grief have historically been treated as distinct phenomena, addressed by different specialists, measured by different tools, understood through different models. And the separation has a practical logic. It allows each field to develop its own literature, language, treatment approaches, but the intention was just clinical precision. In lived experience, the separation frequently does not hold. Every trauma involves some kind of loss, and a traumatic loss, such as the sudden death of a child, a violent bereavement, a death by suicide, the loss following prolonged illness that itself was traumatic, activates both the grief response and the trauma response simultaneously. So the nervous system is affected. The capacity to access memories of the deceased may be compromised by intrusive imagery. The conditions required for grief processing may be disrupted by hypervigilance or shut down. So approaching a traumatic loss exclusively through a grief framework can miss what the trauma is doing. And the other way, approaching it exclusively as trauma can miss what grief requires. So the interaction between the two is where the grief often lives. Imagine a man whose daughter was killed in a road accident, who cannot look at photographs of her without experiencing a panic response. He cannot access his grief in the way others seem able to. He is told he needs grief counseling, but the counseling that focuses on loss keeps arriving at the wall he cannot get past. The wall is the trauma, and it has not yet been addressed. So traumatic loss requires an integrated approach, one that recognizes both the grief response and the trauma response as present and interacting. Neither can be fully resolved while the other is ignored. Professionals who work with grief and trauma, such as I do, and the approach that address both the body's responses to trauma and the heart's response to loss, they offer the most complete pathway for this kind of recovery. So 10 preconceptions, each one formed with some logic, some intention, some effort to make grief and trauma comprehensible and manageable. And each one, when carried unchallenged into an actual experience of loss and trauma, are capable of causing a very specific kind of harm. Not from what happened in itself, but from the gap between what has been expected and what is actually happening. So the purpose of naming these is not to produce guilt, not for those who have held them and not for those who have passed them on. Because most of these preconceptions were received, not chosen. They were like inherited from a culture that has not always known how to sit with grief. But what naming them can do is create space. Space to notice when a preconception is operating. Space to ask whether it's true. And space to give grief, someone else's or your own, the room to be with what actually is, rather than what was assumed it should or would be. So in part 3 of this series, we'll look at presumptions, the real-time assumptions made about someone who's grieving or your own grief. So if preconceptions are the lens we bring to grief, presumptions are the conclusion we draw while watching someone else or watching our own grief move. So different mechanism, significant impact. Before then, if any of the preconceptions covered today rang true, that recognition itself is the beginning of something, not a task, just the beginning of a clearer view. If today's episode has brought some light into your understanding, please share it with someone else. Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to our newsletter on nathaliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Nathalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.